The door at Kaldsund stood open in a wind that could take the skin off a hand, and the woman inside was not going to be the one to shut it. She had a fleece across her knees and a comb in her fist, and she was working the burrs out of it by the gray light coming through that doorway. Because the lamp cost oil and the doorway cost nothing but everything she had. The wind came off the Kaldsund with ice in it. By the middle of the morning, her hands had gone the color of skimmed milk, and she had to stop every so often and put them under her arms until the feeling came back into the ends of them. She did not get up and pull the door to. She had never once, in 22 winters, pulled that door to before the sun was off the water. And if anybody had asked her why, she would have said it was for the light, and she would have half believed it. Her name was Vigdis Ormsdottir, and she held the croft at Kaldsund, which was the oldest hearth on that water and the poorest thing on it. 2 rooms and a byre. A turf roof gone hollow backed over the middle beam. A home field the size of a hall floor, walled with stone her grandfather had lifted, and above it nothing but mountain, and below it nothing but the sea arm, black and moving, all winter long. She had 9 sheep. She had a boat she could just about handle alone in weather that was kind. And the weather up the Kaldsund was not often kind. She had her mother's loom, her mother's iron pot, a chest with almost nothing old in it, and a name that went ahead of her into every room on that water like a smell of smoke in wool. They called it Halla's door. Not to her face. That was the thing about the Kaldsund. Nobody there was cruel in a way they would have recognized as cruelty. They were a hard-working, hospitable, decent people who fed anybody who came up their path and stood out in the dark for a neighbor's lost stock. And they had a story about Kaldsund that they had told for 19 winters. And the 2 facts sat together in them without troubling anybody at all. The story was this. 19 winters ago, the old king's company had come up the Kaldsund on the winter rounds. And by the guest roll, the first night fell to Kaldsund, and Halla Sigmundsdottir had barred her door against them and turned them down the water to Eyrarvik in a storm in the black of the night. That was all. Nobody said she had insulted anybody. Nobody had to. On that water, where a man would take a stranger's frozen boots off with his own hands and put them in his own bed. A barred door was the one crime there was no bottom to. Vigdis had been a daughter not a winter old when it happened. She had no memory of it and had never in her life met a person who did not. So it followed her the way weather follows a valley. The women's bench made room for her with perfect courtesy, and nobody sat close. 3 men had come up the Kaldsund path for her in 4 years, and every one of them had gone away again inside a month. And she knew, because Sigrid had told her, that each of them had been taken aside by somebody kind and told the story first, the way you would warn a man about ground that looked solid. A hearth that had barred its door once could bar it again. That was how they put it. Never mind that the woman it had been in the ground 6 winters, and never mind that her daughter would take a stranger in off that path at any hour of any night and give him the bed and sit up herself with the fire, and did 3 or 4 times a winter, for peddlers and for lost boatmen, and once for a man walking north to his brother's burial with no shoes worth the name. Nobody ever put those 2 things side by side. There was a story. And the story was 19 winters old and had been said aloud so often it had worn smooth. And there is nothing in the world harder to shift than a thing everybody has stopped hearing themselves say. Vigdis had shifted about it exactly once, when she was 14, in the yard at Eyrarvik, with her fists. What she did instead, from that year on, was work. She had her own hay in before the widows up the valley had theirs, and carried it on her back. Because she had no horse, she took the winter fishing alone in a boat meant for 2. She went out on the scree after her 9 sheep in weather that kept grown men in. Because 9 sheep was not a flock a woman could afford to lose one of. And she kept the door open. In the coldest part of the coldest month, with her fingers going white on the comb, She kept that door standing open until the light went off the water, because her mother had made her swear it when she was small enough to sit on the loom bench with her feet not reaching, and had made her swear it again, badly, at the end, with her voice mostly gone. Never let a door be shut in this house. That was all she had of her. That, and the loom, and a habit of silence so total that Vigdis had grown up believing her mother was a proud, cold, closed-up woman who had done a proud, cold, closed-up thing on a winter night and had been too proud to say sorry for it ever after. She had made her peace with that. There are worse inheritances than a stubborn mother. But she had also thought, more times than she would have said out loud, that if the woman had only once gone down to Eyrarvik and said the words, "I was wrong, I am sorry, I would not do it again," then her daughter might have been able to walk into a room on that water without being weather. The autumn moot was on a bright, hard day at the end of the slaughtering month, and Vigdis went down to it because a holder had to, and she went early because she liked to have her back to a post before the hall filled. Eyrarvik was 2 hours down the water on foot. The hall there was the biggest timber building on the Kaldsund, black with 100 years of smoke inside and hung about with dried fish outside. And by the time the sun was over the ridge, it had every hearth holder on that water in it, near enough 60 people, standing in their good wool with the steam coming off them. Ozer Halson was steward of the Kaldsund, and he did the business of the moot the way he did everything, which was thoroughly, pleasantly, and with the certainty of a man who has never in his life been on the wrong side of a room. Then Ozer put his hand flat on a folded skin on the board in front of him and said that he had news out of Solheim, and the hall went quiet in a different way. Because everybody had heard something and nobody had heard it properly. The Alpha King was riding the winter rounds, and this year the rounds came up the Kaldsund. Vigdis felt the hall move around her. It was 19 winters since a king's company had come up that water. It was 9 winters since Ragnvald Torkelson had come to the high seat at Solheim, and in that time he had been to the great waters in the south and the east and the rich halls on the headland, and the Kaldsund was a long, cold thumb of sea with 60 hearths on it, and nothing anybody wanted. And it had been left alone. Now he was coming. 30 men, said Ozer, reading it off the skin. 30 men and 30 horses and the king's own band. Coming over the pass at the end of the frost month and going down the water hearth by hearth, one knight to a hearth, in the old order, by the guest roll. Somebody at the back laughed and said the head of the water had better start brewing. Somebody else said the head of the water had better start praying. It was a good moment in that hall. Every face in it had gone up and open, the way faces do when something enormous is coming that is also unmistakably an honor. And Vigdis was standing against her post with her hands inside her sleeves, feeling the same thing everybody else felt, which was the plain excitement of a great man coming to a small place, and no more than that. Then Ozer opened the guest roll. He did not do it unkindly. That was the part she thought about afterwards. He unrolled it and put his finger on the top of it and read out the order of the hearths on that water, as it had stood since before his father's time, oldest hearth first. And the oldest hearth on the Kaldsund was not the steward's house at Eyrarvik, and was not the big farm at Grindhall, and was not the church holding. It was a 2-room croft under the scree at the top of the water, with 9 sheep and a hollow-backed roof, which had been there before any of them and was on the roll under the name it had always had. Kaldbak, Ozer said. The first night. And then, because he was an honest man and the roll was the roll, he read it again more slowly, as if he expected it to say something else the second time. The hall did not laugh straight away. It took a moment, and what came first was much worse than laughter. It was the sound 60 people make when they turn round to look at the same person at once. A rustle and a creak of benches, and the particular hush of a room deciding what it is about to feel. Vigdis stood with her back against the post and her hands in her sleeves, and watched every face on that water arrive at the same thought, in the same instant. The king's company, the first night, at the door that had been barred. Then the laughter came, and it was not even malicious. And that was worse, too. It was the laughter of people who have been handed a joke of such perfect shape that it would be rude to the gods not to enjoy it. A big, fair man from Grindhall put his head back and roared. 2 women on the bench got themselves in a state and had to hold each other. Somebody said, loudly, that they should send a man up the day before to take the bar off the door and oil the hinges. And the hall took that and made a meal of it, and Vigdis stood there while the best joke of the last 19 winters went round a room she had to live in for the rest of her life. Ozer let it run and then put his hand up and stopped it, which was decent of him, and he looked down the hall at her with an expression she had known since she was small, the honest concern of a man who is about to fix something for you whether or not it is broken. "Kaldsund," he said. "Vigdis, you know what a first night is." She said she knew what a first night was. She did not, in fact, know it in the way he meant, and every soul in that hall knew she did not, and it was not her fault, and everybody knew that too. A first night is not a bed and a bowl. A first night is the whole company off the pass, wet through and 2 days hungry, into a hall with a fire that has been going since dawn, and meat and bread enough that a man does not have to think about it, and ale, and fodder for 30 horses, and straw and fleece for 30 men to sleep on the floor. It is the biggest single thing a household on that water will ever do, and the hearths that could do it began putting it away 2 seasons in advance and talked about it for 20 years afterwards. "Then you know," Ozer said gently, "that it is not a thing a hearth does alone." And he made his offer, there in front of all of them, and he made it well. Eyrarvik would take the first night off her. The role could be turned, hearth for hearth. Kaldsund would go down to the far end and take a night in the tail of the rounds, a quiet night with 6 or 8 men in it, when the king's company was thinned and going home, and Eyrarvik would take the head of it. And because it was not right for a hearth to give up its place on the roll for nothing, Eyrarvik would give Kaldsund 2 milk cows for the turn. It was a good offer. It was a very good offer. 2 cows was more than Kaldsund had been worth on any day of Vigdis's life. She said no. She said it quietly, and she said it into a hall that had not stopped rustling yet, and Ozer did not hear her properly, and asked her to say it again, and she said it again, and this time the hall heard. Then the thing began that she had not expected, which was that they got kinder. Gunhild came off the women's bench and took her hands and told her, with real warmth, that there was no shame in it, that nobody would think a thing of it, that everybody understood. A man from the church holding offered 3 cows. Somebody said Kaldsund could have the first night in name, and Eyrarvik could hold it on Kaldsund's behalf, which was not a thing that existed but which sounded, in that hall, on that morning, like generosity. And under all of it, running through the room like water under ice, was the one sentence nobody said, and everybody was standing on. Better she gives it up than that door does that again. Vigdis got her hands back from Gunhild and said to Ozer that the roll was the roll and Kaldsund was on it, and she would keep her night. And she could hear it as she said it. She could hear exactly what it sounded like coming out of her mouth in that hall, a woman with 9 sheep and no roof to speak of, refusing 3 cows and refusing help and refusing sense, in a voice that had gone flat and hard because she was frightened. It sounded like pride. It sounded like the very thing, in the very house, in the very family, and she watched it land in 60 faces and settle there, and there was not one thing she could have said to stop it, because the true answer was so simple and so enormous that she could not get it into words in front of people. I have got one night. In my whole life, I have got one night when the king's company will come up that path, and my mother's door will be open when they do, and I will be standing in it. She walked home up the water in the last of the light with her hood back because she wanted the cold on her face. And somewhere past the halfway, With the sea arm going gray and the first star out over the ridge, the excitement went out of her all at once, the way heat goes out of a stone, and she began to count. 30 men. 30 horses. Meat for 30 men 2 days off a pass, that was not a sheep. That was 3 sheep at the least, and she had 9. And 9 sheep was the entire difference between Kaldbak being a farm and Kaldbak being a woman living on a hill. Bread for 30 for a night and a morning, and she had barley for herself until spring, and no more than that. Ale, 3 weeks in the making, and she had no malt and no barrel big enough, and nothing to buy either with. Fodder for 30 horses, and her own hay cut for 9 sheep through to the thaw and not one wisp over. Fleece and straw enough to bed 30 men off a cold floor, and she had 9 fleeces, which was 9. Firewood, and a night with 30 men in it needs a fire like a forge from dawn to dawn, and a hall to put them in, 2 rooms with a hollow-backed roof over them, and 30 men would fill both so full that the last 8 would be standing in her byre. She stopped on the path and did the whole count again from the start, because she was a person who checked her sums. It came out the same. It was not tight. It was not going to be difficult. It was impossible, in the plain way that lifting a boat is impossible. And she had 7 weeks. 11 days later, a man came up the Kaldbak path on foot, leading a horse, with a gray wolf walking loose at his heel. Vigdis saw him from the home field wall where she was lifting stone, and she stood up with a stone still in her hands and watched him come. He was a big man, and he came slowly because the path was ice, and he did not have the look of anybody from that water. Plain, undyed sheepskin over wool, no brooch, no rings. Boots that had been good 3 winters ago and had been walked in ever since. A pack roll, a bundle of birch, and a horse worth more than his coat, which happened often enough with men who went about on somebody else's business. The wolf was what made her put the stone down. It was a full-grown gray she-wolf, deep in her winter coat, thick through the neck, walking at the man's knee with her ears up and no rope and no collar anywhere on her, and she came up that path as calm as a house dog, and sat down in the yard when the man stopped. He said good day to her, and asked whether this was the hearth called Kaldbak. She said it was. He said he was riding ahead of the king's rounds for the household at Solheim, going down the roll hearth by hearth to see what each house had and what it would want, and he asked if he might come in and count. Now here is what Vigdis Ormsdottir did not know, and would not know for 7 weeks, and what every soul at Solheim knew and had been sworn about. The man on her path was Ragnvald Torkelson, Alpha King of Solheim, and he had been on the high seat 9 winters. He rode his own roll. He had done it 3 years running, and he did it alone, in that coat, with that horse, and the reason was not a game, and it was not a test of anybody's kindness. On the rounds 4 winters back, a hearth on the Vagar water had given him a night he remembered for months as the best run house he had ever been in. And that spring the man who owned it had sold his land and gone north to work for wages. And the story that came up to Solheim was that the night had cost him everything he had, and he had been too proud to say so. It was the 3rd in 9 years. And when Ragnvald had put the question to his own household, what does a guesting cost a small hearth? He had got 3 different answers from 3 men who all loved him, and all 3 were nonsense. Because nobody who has seen the crown come through a door will tell you the truth about what it did to their winter. A king asking that question gets the answer a king is owed. So he had stopped asking as a king. He had come up the Kaldsund expecting the usual. He had heard at the last 2 hearths all about the first night. He had heard it 5 times before he was halfway up the water, and he had heard it told 5 different ways, and all of them ended the same, with a woman under the scree who had refused 3 cows out of pride. "You may come in and count," Vigdis said. "You'll want to see it before you say what it will want." That was how it started. She took him through the whole of it, and she did not soften a single thing, because there was no point. She showed him the 2 rooms, and where the roof had gone hollow over the middle beam, and where the wet came in at the gable in a southwest wind. She showed him the byre and the 9 sheep in it, and the space at the end where 8 men would have to stand. She opened her meal chest and let him look into it, which is not a small thing to let a stranger do, and she told him what was in the storehouse, and what was in the ground, and what was in the boat, and how much hay was in the little barn, and what it was cut for. He asked what she had for ale. "Nothing," she said. "I've no malt and no barrel over 2 measures." "I know." He asked what she had for meat. 9 sheep, she said. "That's it. That's the flock." He wrote nothing down. She noticed it and thought little of it at the time. A great many men on that water could not write, and did their counting in their heads, and were better at it than the ones who could. What she did notice, because it was strange, was the shape of his questions. A forerunner asks what a house has. This man asked what it would cost. He asked her how long it had taken her to build the 9 up from the 4 she had started with. He asked how many winters it would take to put a flock back if it went. He asked what she would be eating in the spring if the barley in that chest went into bread in the frost month, and when she told him. He stopped in the middle of the byre floor and stood there a moment with his hand on the post. Then he said, "You were offered 3 cows for the night." "Word gets about," said Vigdis. "Down the whole water," he said. "It's the best story on the Kaldsund. Why did you say no?" And she found that she could not tell him, any more than she had been able to tell the hall. So she told him the part of it that was easy to say and true enough. "Because Kaldbak is on the roll," she said, "and I hold Kaldbak." He looked at her for a moment and let it be, and he never asked her that question again in the whole of the 7 weeks, which was one of the things about him. He said instead that he would tell her plainly what a first night was. Because if she was going to do it, she had better be told by somebody who had watched 40 of them, and not by a hall full of people enjoying themselves. They sat down on the loom bench with the door open and the light coming in, and the wolf lying across the threshold in it, and he told her. The company would come off the pass in the afternoon if the pass was clean, and after dark if it was not. 30 men. They would want heat before anything else, and then they would want to be fed, and what a company off a pass wants is not a fine thing. It is a great deal of a plain thing. Hot. And more of it after that. The horses came first in practice, and the men knew it. The king's own men bedded down on the floor with the rest, and any hearth that tried to give the band better than the band got made a fool of. "And there is one part of the night you cannot get wrong," he said, so I'll say it twice. The guest cup. When the company came into the yard, they would stop, all of them, and not a man of them would say a word or move a foot, because the roof word had not been given yet. And the holder of the hearth would come out of her own door carrying the cup in both hands, and she would give it into the hands of the highest man there, and he would take it and give her the roof word back, the house named and the holder named, and the promise that she and hers were safe from him and his while he stood under her roof. And when he had said it, the company would answer him, all together, and then it was a guesting, and not before. "Into the hands of the highest man there," Vigdis said. "Yes, and if I don't know which one he is?" "Then you ask," said the forerunner. "It's allowed. It's a small shame, and it's allowed. And if I give it to the wrong man?" He was quiet for long enough that she looked up from her hands. "The cup is given once," he said. "It cannot be taken back and given again. If you put it into the wrong hands, then that man has had the roof word off your house, and the man who should have had it stood in your yard and was passed over in front of 30 people. There was a marriage on the Vagerwater 30 years ago that ended over it. Not a quarrel. A marriage. And 2 houses. And it took a lawman 4 years to unpick. Then tell me how to know him." And here, if she had been looking properly, she might have seen something go across that big weathered face, because it was a hard question to be asked by a woman with a comb in her lap, and he did not want to lie to her, and he could not tell her the truth, and what he said was the exact truth said in a way that was no use to her at all. "He travels in what his men travel in," he said. "There's nothing on him to see. You'll have to look at the men and not at him. Look for the one they've made a space round." She thought about that for a while, and then she said, "And in the dark, with 30 men in cloaks and snow on all of them?" "Then you ask," he said again. "It's allowed." "Not at that door it isn't," said Vigdis. He did not ask her what she meant. He had heard it 5 times on the way up the water. He said he had 4 more hearths to see before the pass shut, and she said the usual, which was that he would take a bed and a meal before he went, and he said the usual back, which was that he would not put her out. And then Vigdis Ormsdottir said the thing that decided the next 7 weeks of both their lives. Standing up with her hands full of fleece and no idea in the world what she was doing. "There's a hole in that roof," she said, "and I can't get up on it alone, and there's 30 men coming to sleep under it. Can you split shingle?" He said he could. "Then stay and split shingle," she said, "and eat at my table while you do it, and go when it's done. I can't pay you. I'll say that now, so it's said. I'm paid out of Solheim," he said. "Then you're not staying on my account," said Vigdis, "and that suits me." Because here was her rule, and she laid it out for him that first evening as plainly as she had laid out the state of her meal chest, and she never once bent it in 7 weeks. Nothing that went on that table on that night could be a gift. Not a barrel from Eyrarvik, not a lamb from the church holding, not a sack of malt from a woman being kind. Everything the king's company ate and drank and slept on at Kaldbak had to come off Kaldbak, or out of Kaldbak's work, or out of Kaldbak's boat, or the whole thing was worth nothing at all. Because the moment one sack of another hearth's barley went into that bread, the story on that water would not be that Kaldbak had held the first night. The story would be that the Kaldsund had held it for her, that they had all clubbed together and carried the poor creature through it, that they had gone up and taken the bar off the door for her, and she would have handed them, with her own hands, a better and kinder and more permanent version of the story she had been carrying since before she could walk. "So you'll take work off me and food off me," the forerunner said, "and nothing else off anybody. That's it. That's a hard road for 7 weeks. "It's 7 weeks," said Vigdis. "It's not a life." He stayed. He was meant to stay 2 days, and he went back over the pass 3 times that autumn on Solheim's business, and came back over it 3 times. And by the frost month there was a place in the Byre where his roll lived, and a hook by the door with his coat on it. And the whole water knew that the woman at Kaldbak had a man from the king's household splitting shingle for his dinner, and thought it very like her. To have got herself the one kind of help that could not be counted as help. His name she got out of him on the 4th day, and not easily. "You'll have to be called something," she said. "I'm not shouting you across a roof. It doesn't matter what I'm called. It matters to me who's under my roof," said Vigdis. He said, after a moment, "Rain." "Rain what?" "Rain's enough," and she let it be, because a great many men who worked for great households had reasons of their own, and because she had been let be about the 3 cows. The wolf's name was Ylva, and Ylva slept across the threshold, and this turned out to matter. Vigdis had never been able to explain the door to anybody, and she did not try to explain it to him. She simply did not shut it, and on the first cold night he watched her not shut it, and on the second night he got up without a word, and dragged the windscreen round from the gable, and set it so the draught went along the wall instead of into the room, and then he sat down again. He never once said, "You'll freeze." He noticed it the way a person notices a limp, and he built round it. And Ylva took to lying in the gap with her back to the weather like something put there on purpose. and after that the door stood open at Kaldbak all winter with a wolf in it. It was the 5th evening, with the shingles stacked and the light gone and the fire down to a good red, that he asked her. He asked it carefully. He asked what had happened at that door, and Vigdis told him. She told it flat, the way you tell a thing about yourself that you have decided not to be hurt by anymore, and she told it as she had been told it, which is to say she told it against her own mother, because that was the only version there was. The old king's company had come up the Kaldsund on the rounds 19 winters ago. The first night fell to Kaldbak, as it always did. It had been a filthy night, and they had come off the pass late and in a storm. And Halla Sigmundsdottir had put the bar across her door and stood behind it, and told the king's forerunner to take the company on down to Eyrarvik, and would not open, and would not come out, and would not say why. So 30 men went another 2 hours down a black water in a storm, and got a fine welcome at Eyrarvik. And Kaldbak's name went into the mouth of every house on that sound and has been there ever since. And I've heard it said, she finished, that she stood there with the bar in her hands and never said one word to them. Not sorry. Nothing. And I've thought about that every day of my life, because I'd give a good deal to know what was in her, and there's nobody left to ask. The fire moved. The wolf's ear turned. That's all of it? He said. That's all anybody has. He was looking into the fire and not at her, and he said in a voice she thought about a great deal afterwards, "There'd be more than that. There always is." "There isn't," said Vigdis. "There's a barred door and 19 winters. That's the whole of my family. And in 7 weeks I'm going to stand in that same doorway with a cup in my hands, and if my hand shakes, that's what the Kaldsund gets to talk about for the next 19. What she did in those 7 weeks got told up and down the Kaldsund for 40 years afterwards, and every teller left something out, because there was too much of it to hold in one telling. She went down to the trading ground at the mouth of the Sound in the first week of the frost month, and hired herself out to a merchant off a nar for 9 days, gutting and salting, standing in brine to the wrist from before light until she could not see. And she came home up the water with malt for 3 brewings, and a barrel that took 8 measures and a bad hand that never quite came right after. She wove at night. She had 40 ells of plain wool off that loom in 5 weeks, working it after the day's work was done, and she took the 40 ells to the big farm at Grindhall and came away with 2 loads of hay and a promise of the cart to fetch it. And Grindhall's wife tried to put a cheese in on top of the bargain, and Vigdis handed it back at the gate. She cut turf until the ground shut. She went along the tide line every morning of those 7 weeks for driftwood, and had a stack of it by the Byre gable the length of the Byre. She took the boat out alone for the winter fish in weather her neighbors watched from their doors, and salted what she got, and did it again. She scoured the 2 rooms down to the boards. She borrowed nothing. Sigrid came up the path in the 3rd week with a sack of barley under her cloak. She was Vigdis's cousin, and the nearest thing to a friend she had, a soft, worried, decent woman married to a man with a farm and opinions. And she put the sack down inside the door and could not look at her. "It's from my own store," she said. "It's not from him. He doesn't know." Vigdis sat her down and gave her the good chair and hot water with meadowsweet in it, because that was what the house had, and then she picked the sack up and put it back in her cousin's arms and walked her to the gate with it. "Vigdis, I know. You'll not do it. Then I'll not do it," said Vigdis, "and it'll be me that didn't." Sigrid cried on the path, and Vigdis stood and let her, and that was the last help anybody offered from Eyrarvik, because the story went back down the water that Kaldbak had turned away a sack of barley at its own door, and the water heard it, and nodded, and said, "Well, there it is. That's the house." The ale went on in the Byre end in a barrel she had scalded 3 times. The bread she could not solve until the 4th week, when she worked out that she could not bake for 30 in the hearth she had, and would have to build a second oven out of stone and turf against the gable. And she built it, badly and then properly, and burnt 2 batches learning it, and could not afford to burn a third. And in the middle of all of it, on a bright still afternoon with the water like tin, she made him stand in the yard and be the king. It was his idea in the sense that he had said, mildly, that a thing done once is easier the second time. She would not have asked. But she was so frightened of that doorway by then that she had begun to dream about it. And so she took the cup down off the shelf, a plain thing, birch, with a band of carving round it that her grandmother's father had cut, and she filled it with water because ale was too dear, and she put Rain out in the yard by the wall and told him to be 30 men. "You'll have to come up the path," she said. "You can't just be standing there." So he went down the path and came up it, and stopped, and stood, and Vigdis came out of her own door with the cup in both hands and got 4 steps into the yard and found that she could not do it. It was ridiculous. There was nobody there. It was a man in a sheepskin coat with a wolf sitting beside him and the sun going down behind the ridge and her whole yard empty, and she stood in the middle of it with a cup of water in her hands, and her arms would not go out and her mouth would not open, and after a moment she started to laugh, and then it was not laughing, and she turned round to go back inside. He did not let her go past him. He did not touch her either. He simply stood so that going back in meant going round him, and he waited. And when she had got her face straight, he said, "Give it to me." She gave him the cup. He took it in both hands the way it is taken, and he looked down at her, and she remembered afterwards that he did not have to think about the words, not for a heartbeat, which she put down at the time to a man who had watched 40 of them. "Kaldbak's fire and Kaldbak's roof," he said, "and Vigdis Ormsdottir who holds them. You and yours are safe from me and mine while I stand under it." The wind came off the sound. The wolf yawned. "That's all of it?" said Vigdis. "That's all of it." Then the company answers, "And then you're a hearth that's given a king his night, and nothing anybody says after that is worth anything." "Say it again." He said it again. She made him say it 4 times, and the 4th time she got her arms out straight and her voice level and her chin up, and when he had finished, she took the cup back and stood holding it and said, "If I do that, my mother's door will have been open." And Ragnvald Torkelson stood in her yard with the cup gone out of his hands and did not say a word, because there was nothing he could say from inside that coat that would not have been a lie. Ozer Halson came up the path in the 5th week with 4 men and the roll. He came, he said, with no pleasure in it. And Vigdis believed him. Ozer was not a bad man. He was a man who had been steward of that water for 11 years and had a great many things to be right about. And the thing he was about to be right about was one he had genuinely lost sleep over. The guest roll had a measure on it. That was the part nobody down the water had bothered to say out loud in the hall, because everybody who could hold a night knew it by heart. A hearth was not merely obliged to do its best. A hearth on the roll had to furnish the night's measure, so much bread by weight, so much ale by measure, fodder for the horses of the company, fleece and straw enough to bed them, fire from dawn to dawn, and meat named in the roll as its own item, because a guesting without meat on the board is not a guesting and never has been. And if a hearth could not furnish the measure, the steward of the water might strike it off the roll and put the night on a hearth that could. And it was not a shame to the house. It was bookkeeping. It was there so that no king's company would ever ride 2 days over a pass and arrive at a door with nothing behind it. So they counted her. It took most of the afternoon, and it was, in its way, worse than the laughing had been. 4 men in her storehouse with a rushlight calling it out. The barrel, 8 measures, sound, ale working well, over the measure asked. The bread, enough barley and enough oven. And one of the women said so twice because she had not believed the oven when she saw it. fodder, 2 loads of Grindhall hay and her own cut standing untouched. Fleece and straw, 9 fleeces. 3 sacks of shore sedge dried in the byre, and a stack of driftwood the length of a byre wall that one of Ozer's men whistled at. Meat, 9 sheep, Ozer said. 9, said Vigdis. On the hill. On the hill. He stood in her yard with the roll in his hand and did the thing she had been dreading for 5 weeks, which was to be kind to her in public with the truth on his side. Vigdis, the measure for 30 men off a pass is 3 beasts and the sound of a 4th. That's not me. That's the roll. And it was written by men who'd fed companies. If you put 3 of 9 on that board, you'll have 6 sheep and no ram left worth the name. And by the thaw you'll have nothing that lambs. And by next winter there is no farm here. There's a woman on a hill. And if you put 3 on and the company eats 4, then it's your name in front of the king's household and mine in front of the king's household, and this waters for 20 years. I've come up here to take it off you, and there's no shame in it, and if you'll say the word, I'll write the turn on the roll now, and you'll not lose 1 hoof of it. And Vigdis Ormsdottir, who had been standing in brine to the wrist and carrying shingle up a ladder in a gale, and had not slept a whole night in 5 weeks, said, You'll have your meat, Ozer. Come and count it on the day. He went down the water. And that evening rain came in off the roof and found her sitting on the loom bench with her hands hanging between her knees, and they had the only real quarrel they ever had. He had a way out for her, and he laid it in front of her. There was, he said, a thing that was done on the rounds and done often. A company on the road did not always eat the hearth-sown meat. Solheim's household sent stock ahead where a hearth was known to be small, and it went on the board as the hearth-sown, and no man in the company knew or cared. And it was not charity. It was how the thing was managed in a hard country, and he could have 3 beasts up that path inside a week with a word. She said no before he had finished. He said she had not heard it out. She said she had heard all of it in the first 6 words, and the answer was no. And he said, standing over her with his hands still black from the roof, that she was going to hand over the entire flock, everything she owned that made a sound in the morning, everything she had built out of 4 ewes in 6 years, for 1 night. And for what? For 30 men who would eat it and sleep on her floor and go down the water and forget the name of the house by the 2nd night, that the men she was doing it for would not have asked it of her, that not one of them, not the least of them, would want it. Then, it's a good thing none of them's being asked, said Vigdis. It's 1 night. It's the only one I get. She was on her feet by then. You've watched 40 of them. There'll be 40 more, and you'll not remember which was which. I have got 1. There is 1 night in the whole of my life when the king's company comes up that path, and either it comes to a hearth that fed it out of its own hands, or it comes to a poor thing that had it done for her by a household in Solheim that felt sorry for her, and I'll tell you what happens then. Nothing happens then. Nothing changes then. Halla's door stays what it is for another 19 winters, and I go on being weather in that hall, and when I'm in the ground, somebody's daughter up here gets to carry it. That's what your 3 beasts cost. You're offering to buy me out of the 1 thing I've got, and you're calling it help. And he stood there and took it, and did not answer, because the honest answer was, I am not a household man. I am the man they are all coming for, and if you would let me I could end this in a sentence. And he had learned in 3 seasons of that coat exactly what a sentence like that does to a house. It ends the thing you came to find out. She would never have said another true word to him. And under that there was a second reason, which he was less proud of, and which he had not looked at squarely yet, and it was that in 5 weeks of splitting shingle in a yard under a scree he had been spoken to as a man, roughly, and without 1 grain of care for what he was, and he had not had that since he was 25 years old, and he could not make himself put an end to it. So he said, I, All right. And 3 days later, Vigdis took the 9 sheep down the water to Eyrarvik. She walked them herself, and it took most of a day, and she stopped twice on the road for no reason at all. At Eyrarvik, she traded the whole flock, 9 head, the ram, the 3 good young ewes, all of it, to the church holding and to Grindhall between them. And she took it in meat and salt, and 2 barrels, and a little iron. And she stood in the trading yard while they were driven off in the other direction, and did not go and look. Then she walked home up the water in the dark, with an empty hill behind her, and a cartload coming after her in the morning. And when she got to the top of the path, René was sitting on the wall in the cold, with the wolf beside him, waiting, the way he had been waiting for 2 hours. "It's done," she said. "I know." After the night, she said, "I'll go into service. Grindhall wants a woman for the wool room, and I can have the place in the spring. I'll be back up here for the summer grazing, and I'll build it again out of whatever I can put by. 6 years, likely I've done the sum. It's 6 years. She said it perfectly steadily. And then she went past him into the house without another word, because she had got to the end of what she could carry in front of anybody. And the door stood open behind her the way it always did. And the king of Solheim sat on her wall in the dark and looked at the empty hill and had 12 days left to think of something. The pass shut 2 days before the night, and everybody on the Kaldsund said the same thing, which was that the company would turn back, and it would all have been for nothing. It did not turn back. It came over on foot, leading the horses, and it took them from before light until well after dark, and the weather that came down the Sound that evening was the same weather that had come down it 19 winters before, which nobody at Kaldbak said out loud. Rain had gone at dawn. Solheim's business, he said, and he would be back with them, and he took the wolf. And Vigdis had barely looked up from the oven when he went, because there were 30 men coming, and she had bread in, and everything in her hands was shaking from 3 nights without sleep. By the middle of the afternoon, her yard had 20 people in it who had not been invited. Ozer came, because the steward of the water attends the first night, and that was fair. Gunhild came with him, and Grindhall's man and his wife and Sigrid, standing well back with her hood up. They came to see the king's company. They came also, every one of them, for the other thing, and nobody would have admitted it, and nobody had to, because the whole Kaldsund had been telling itself for 7 weeks that the woman would be shamed, and had begun to want to be there when she was. They stood along the home field wall in the snow, and they saw the yard swept and sanded, and the second oven going, and the byre bedded down the whole length of it, and the fire in that little hall built so high that you could feel the heat 20 paces out in the yard. Nobody said very much after that. The light went. The wind got up. And at some time past the black of full dark, from a long way down the path, they heard the company coming. They came in wrong. Vigdis had been told for 7 weeks how it would go. The company would come up in the afternoon in good order and stop in the yard and be a shape you could read. What came up her path at that hour was a line of men who had been on a pass since before light, and off it in a storm since dusk, and they came in a straggle in the dark with the horses in among them, all of them plastered to the shoulder in wet snow, all of them hooded, all of them in the same wool and the same fur with the same white crust over it. And they came into the light of her doorway and stopped where they stood, and there was no order in them at all. There was no man in the middle and no space made round anybody. There were 30 shapes in her yard, steaming, with their heads down out of the wind, and not one of them said a word, because not a word may be said before the roof word is given. She had the cup in both hands. She had had it in both hands for an hour. She came out of her own door, and the snow came sideways into her face, and she went 5 steps into her own yard and stopped, and she looked at them, and she could not tell. There was not a face to be seen under any hood in that yard. There was nothing on any man of them to see. They were 30 dark shapes, and the whole water was standing along her wall in the dark behind her, waiting. And the silence went on and on because it could not end until she ended it, and she felt the thing she had been dreaming about for 7 weeks come down on her exactly as it had come down in the dreams. Then she saw, at the edge of the light, by her byre door, a coat she knew. He was standing holding the door of her own byre open with his shoulder to let the horses in the plain sheepskin with no rings on it. And the wolf was at his knee, and he was the only thing in that yard that belonged to her. She went to him. She went to him the way you go to the one lit window in a strange place, straight across the yard with the snow going into her mouth. And when she got to him, she did not hold out the cup, and she did not offer it. She pushed it at his chest for him to take hold of while she looked. She got a fistful of his coat with her other hand, and she put her face up close to his so that nobody along that wall would hear her. And she said, low and fast, "Hold this. I can't tell which one he is. They're all the same. There's nothing on any of them, and I can't ask. Not here, not in front of them, please. Which one is he? Just tell me which one." He took the cup out of her hands. He took it in both hands, the way it is taken. And Vigdis, who was still holding his coat, felt the yard change before she understood a single thing about it. And she looked up at him, and he was not looking at her the way a man looks at a woman who has asked him a question. He was looking down at her the way she had seen him look once before, in the afternoon in an empty yard, with a cup of water in his hands and nobody watching. "Kaldbak's fire and Kaldbak's roof," said the Alpha King of Solheim, "and Vigdis Ormsdottir, who holds them. You and yours are safe from me and mine while I stand under it." She let go of his coat. She heard it. She understood the words. What she understood at the same instant, and much more clearly because it was the thing she had carried for 7 weeks and it went off in her like a stone through ice, was that the cup was given once and could not be given again. And that she had just put the roofward of her house into the hands of a hired man in front of the king's whole company, and along a wall of her own neighbors. And that the highest man in that yard was standing somewhere out there in the dark, having been passed over by the woman at the door. "No," she said. "No, that's not." She turned round to the yard with her hand out for the cup, to take it back, to undo it, to tell 30 men that she had made a mistake, and would they let her make it again. And out of the dark, 30 voices answered him. They said it all together, the way it is said. The way it had been said in that language for 400 years. And it came out of the snow all round her from men she could not see, and we with him, under this roof. And this house is not to be harmed by any of us. Then the yard began to move. Hoods came back. The horses went into the byre. Somebody laughed at something somebody else said, because it was a guesting now and men could speak. And Vigdis Ormsdottir stood in the middle of it with her empty hands out in front of her and the snow melting on her face, and looked up at the man who had spent 7 weeks on her roof and eaten at her table and split her firewood and let her shout at him about 3 beasts. And she said, "Rain, Ragnvald," he said. "Torkelson. I would have told you 3 times, and I could not find a way to do it that did not cost you the night." Along the wall, the Kaldsund had gone entirely quiet. Here is what she did next, and this is the part they told for 40 years. She stood there for about the space of 6 breaths, and her face did what a face does. And then she wiped it with the back of her wrist and turned round and went and fed 30 men. Because they had been on a pass since before light, and there was mutton in that pot, and 40 loaves in that oven, and the ale was 3 weeks in the making, and there would be a time for the other thing after. She had them in and got them out of their wet, and put them along both rooms and down the byre. She carried, and cut, and poured, and told a man 3 times her size to get his boots off her clean straw, and she did not sit down once from the black of dark to the middle of the night, and by the time the company had eaten its fill there was not a man in the king's band who did not know exactly whose house he was in. It was Ozer, sitting stiff and gray by the door and having the worst evening of his life, who said the thing that started it. He said to the king, with real feeling, that it must be said aloud in front of everybody that what had been set before them tonight had come off this holding and no other. And an old man sitting at the end of the bench by the fire put down what he was holding and said, "What is this hearth called again?" He was the oldest man in the company by 20 years. He had come over that pass on foot with the rest of them and had not made a thing of it. His name was Bardson, and he had ridden ahead of king's companies on the winter rounds for 40 years, and he had been going quiet for the last hour, since the sanded yard and the swept floor. And he had said nothing at all since the roof word. "Kaldbak," said Vigdis. "And who held it before you?" "My mother, Halla Sigmundsdottir." The old man sat looking at the fire. Then he got up, which took him a while, and he turned to the high seat where the king was sitting in the best chair in that house, which was a loom bench with a fleece over it, and he asked leave to be released from an oath. And he said where he had sworn it, and when, and the room went cold from the door inwards. "It's not mine to release," said Ragnvald. "You swore it to this hearth." So the old man turned round and stood in front of a woman of 22 years with his hat in his hands, and asked her, as the holder of Kaldbak, to release him from an oath he had sworn to her mother at that doorway 19 winters ago on a night just like this one. Vigdis had to say it twice before it came out properly. "I release you." And Bardson told them. He had come up that path in front of the old king's company at the head of a storm, and the door of the house was barred, which he had never once met before in 40 years, and never met again after. A woman spoke to him from behind it and would not open, and told him to take the company down to Eyrarvik and lose no time about it. And when he stood there and argued with a bar of wood, and he had argued, he said, he had put his shoulder to that door and told her plainly what would be said about her house. The woman behind it said this to him: "There is sickness on this floor. It came off the boat 9 days ago, and it has taken my husband and 2 more. And if you put 30 men in this room tonight, you will carry it down this water and over that pass and into the king's hall, and I will not have it." And then she made her bargain with him through the wood. And Thorgils, who was a young man then and had been given no instruction for anything of the kind, made it. He was to say nothing. Not to the company, not to the steward, not to any soul on that water, ever, as long as she lived and after. Because a house named for the sickness in that year on that sound did not get sympathy. It got its stock driven off, its wool burned, its roof pulled, and nobody within 20 miles would take in what came out of it. It had happened at 2 hearths on the Vægurwater the winter before, and everybody knew it. Halla Sigmundsdottir had a husband in the next room and a daughter not a winter old, and she had exactly one thing to trade with, the name of her house, and she traded it, in the dark, through a barred door to a stranger, in about the time it takes to say it. She asked me what they'd say about her, the old man said. I told her the truth. I said they'd say you shut your door on the king, and she said, let them. And she asked me to swear, and I swore, and I took the company down that water, and I have kept it 19 winters, and I never once. He stopped and started again. It never came into my head that the child in the next room would grow up and be told the same story as everybody else. I thought she'd know. I have thought all this while that somewhere on this water there was one person who knew. Nobody in that room said anything at all. Then Vigdis Ormsdottir put her hand out and found the doorpost of her own house, and she said, everything soft in here was burned. She said it to nobody. She said it the way a person reads something. There's no old cloth in this house. Not a bed cover, not a hanging, nothing of my grandmother's. I've got the loom and I've got the pot. Iron and oak. I've been told my whole life it's because we were poor." She looked round the 2 rooms full of the king's men, at the swept boards and the whitened walls and the door standing open into the snow with a wolf lying in the gap of it. And she never let a door be shut in this house. Not once. She made me swear it when I was 4 years old, and she made me swear it again when she was dying, and I've kept it every day of my life, and I never knew what it was. And I have been ashamed of her since I was old enough to be told to be. Ozer Halson got up off his bench and stood there, and he was a decent man, and there was nothing whatever for him to do or say, and after a moment he sat down again. That is how the shame story of the Kaldsund ended, not in a quarrel, and not with anybody being punished, but with an old man taking his hat off in a poor house, and a woman finding out at 22 years of age what her mother had bought her with. The king of Solheim rode out 2 days later, because a company on the rounds cannot stay, and before he went he stood in that yard with the whole household of Kaldbak, which was 1 woman, and did 3 things. He did not offer to make good what the night had cost her. She had told him, sitting up by the fire in the small hours, in numbers exactly what it had cost: 9 head, 40 ells, 9 days in brine, 6 years to build back, and he had listened to every figure without once reaching for his purse. Because he had finally got the answer he had put on that coat to find, and he had got it from the person it had cost the most. And he was not going to insult it by paying it off. What he did instead was change the roll. Before the company left the Kaldsund, he had it cut into the guest roll of that water, and within 2 years into every roll in the north, that the night's measure was to be fixed at what the smallest hearth could furnish, and that anything above it was the hearth's own pride and no man's right, so that no house would ever again be beggared for a night, and no woman stand in brine 9 days to feed men who would have been happy with bread. The second thing was Kaldbak's. He left the first night where it was. He had 20 people tell him to move it, and he would not. And Kaldbak has had the first night of the rounds on that water ever since. And the third thing he did was ask her, in the yard, in front of the wall where the Kaldsund had stood to watch her fail. He did not do it grandly. He said he had come up that path in autumn to count what a night cost a house, and that the answer had been standing in front of him for 7 weeks. That he had been spoken to as a man in that yard for the first time since he was 25 years old, and shouted at, and fed, and put on a roof, and that he was not asking the woman who had held the first night, or the daughter of Halla Sigmundsdottir. He was asking her. Vigdis looked at him for a long moment. The company was formed up on the path. The wolf was sitting in the door. Then she turned round and pushed her own door wide open against the wall. All the way she did every morning of her life, and put a stone against the foot of it so the wind could not take it, and stood in it. "You'd better come in then," she said. "It's open." They were hand-fasted at Solheim at the Frostmoon, and the woman who had been weather in the Eyrarvik hall went down that water in the spring, with the king of Solheim on one side of her, and an old road warden on the other, and there was not a hearth on the Kaldsund that did not come out to its gate. But that is not the end anybody up there tells. The end they tell is that the hall at Solheim has a great carved door on the seaside that had been shut in winter since it was built, and that it is not shut now, that it stands open from first light until the sun is off the water, whatever the weather is doing, and that the queen will not hear one word about the cost of the firewood, and that in the gap of it, out of the wind, with her back to the weather and her ears up, there lies a gray wolf, so that the door can stay open all night.